June 25th, 1950. This is the date engraved deep into all Koreans' minds, like a formula. The Korean War that broke out in 1950 destroyed everything. Millions were displaced, and even daily places, like schools that should have been the safest sanctuary for kids, began to crumble. And the Korean War showed no clear end in sight. The present was consumed by war, yet, in the hope that someday this will all end, South Korea continued with one thing for the future: education. Koreans knew that after all gunfires were seized, reforming the society would require more than rebuilding just the infrastructures. It would require people prepared to carry the weight of the new society. Through compulsory education during Korean War and nationwide literacy campaigns in its aftermath, South Korea transformed basic education from privilege into a mass right, marking an educational revolution that reformed society despite the devastation of war. South Korea's struggle for learning all started in 1948. Around 1945, after World War II ended, a period of confusion struck the country. As a solution, South Korea chose education as a key to revolutionizing society. In 1948, the compulsory education policy was enacted through the Article 31 of the Constitution of the Republic of Korea, stipulating that all citizens have the right to receive education equally, and that at least elementary education shall be compulsory and free of charge. This policy became even more intricate a year later through the release of Education Act in 1949. But this system faced difficulties as the Korean War broke out. Schools were destroyed. Children were struggling to survive instead of holding books. Despite the war, the Korean government's choice was to not let go of the pen and hold on to it. They chose to maintain the compulsory education. Temporary schools were set up even in refugee camps. A new enforcement decree of Education Act was declared. Even during war, the spirit that schools must continue was preserved, and education became the only place where tomorrow still existed. After the ceasefire, the effort continued, being implemented in the form of a 6-year plan for the completion of compulsory education from 1954 to 1959. However, in reality, although compulsory education was guaranteed by law, that didn't mean equal education opportunities for everyone.
왜냐하면 한국은 제한헌법에서부터 의무교육을 명시했고 그 의무교육에 대해서 무상이라는 말을 갖다 붙였어요. 헌법에 나와요. 한국의 초등교육은 의무로 하고 무상으로 합니다. 근데 한국의 교육은 무상 교육이 아니었어요. 실제로는 학부모들의 주머니를 털어서 교육을 시킨 거죠. 그리고 그것을 아주 뭐랄까요? 그 정부도 문교 당국도 공공연하게 얘기했어요. 어떤 원칙? 수익자 부담의 원칙. 즉 교육을 받아서 이익을 챙기는 건 학생들이니까 니들이 돈 내라. 그래서 초등학교 때부터 온갖 잡부금 이런 것들을 갖다가 걷어들여서 결국에는 이제 그 돈으로 학교를 운영하면서 아이들을 교육시킨 거죠. 그렇기 때문에 이건
Tuition was waived, but school supplies and transportation costs still fell on each family under the name of school operation support fees. For children from poor families, school was both a right and a burden. Recognizing the distance between policy and reality, South Korea knew that they needed a revolutionary shift, something transformative that could generate social reaction and prepare the people necessary for the national reformation. And their solution was the literacy movement. In 1954, the South Korean government established its first nationwide literacy education policy for adults. Through this plan, over 50,000 education classes were set up across the country, and hundreds and thousands of adult learners began studying the Korean character, Hangul. The planning documents laid out specific details, like the duration of education, the number of instructors to be deployed, and the quantity of textbooks to be distributed. At the center of this plan were the ministries of the government. The Ministry of Education produced textbooks, trained instructors, and supported the establishment of local classes through regional networks. And the Ministry of National Defense issued directives for basic literacy education among soldiers during military service. Now, this was not just an education campaign directed by the ministries alone. It was a national project involving the general people as well. One of the primary organizations were yahak, night schools in Korean. For workers, classes were held at night. Also, classrooms were not school buildings, but they were village halls, churches, and community spaces. Yet, beyond the policy directives and improvised classrooms, it was individuals who volunteered to carry this campaign forward.
미군들이 이제 쳐준 거죠, 유엔군들이. 근데 천막 칠 공간이 부족하니까 그 50인용 천막에 두 학급이 들어갔어요.
책상이니 뭐 이제 이것도 옳은 거 없었죠.
This policy did not end as short-term reaction. According to UNESCO and research on Korean education history, the adult literacy rate in South Korea around 1950s was about 20%. But as compulsory education and literacy campaigns took hold, the rate rose, reaching 70% by the mid-1960s and surpassing 80% by the early 1970s. But there were changes that could not be simply measured by statistics. In schools and night classes, people wrote their own names for the first time. They read envelopes without asking for help. They recognized store signs and bus numbers on their own. Documents became the information that they could actually understand. Education gave people the power to act independently, and this was the transformation of everyday life. Furthermore, it extended into public life. In the early 1960s, a voter turnout in National Assembly elections exceeded 80%. Citizens who had learned to read could now understand ballots, identify candidates, and vote independently. Without literacy, the right to vote would have remained hollow, dependent on others' guidance. But education gave that right substance. Literacy didn't just enable participation, but it made democracy possible in South Korea. The literacy movement was the spark for a structural reform of South Korean industry. In the early 1960s, approximately 63% of South Korea's workforce was concentrated in primary industries like agriculture and fishing. However, as literacy rates soared and compulsory education expanded, the industry moved into heavy and chemical industrialization in the 1970s, and the demand for skilled labor skyrocketed. By the 1990s, the proportion of workers in the tertiary sector exceeded 60%, marking South Korea's successful transition into a knowledge-based economy. History now remembers this rapid reformation as the miracle of the Han River, a phenomenal growth from 1960s to the mid-1990s, leaping forward to become the world's 13th largest economy. In the middle of the Korean War, South Koreans chose education as their tool for reformation. Because, like how they had to take up weapons to protect their families and homes during wartime, they knew that they needed pens to build new houses for the future. Through compulsory schooling and elimination of illiteracy, education evolved into a power engine, a mass right, and also a ladder for social mobility. Then, what happened afterwards? Well, what followed was not just a simple recovery, but a chain of reaction with various struggles. The revolution of literacy produced a generation that could read, write, and learn. This led to a powerful reaction in the next generation, allowing them to become the workforce that powered industrialization. Then, literacy turned into participation, participation into productivity, and productivity into national reform. And this reshaped a war-torn nation into one of the fastest-growing countries in the last 20th century. Today, South Korea is known for its intense passion for education, often criticized for its competition and pressure. Yet, now we know that behind the rankings and statistics lies a deeper history. Education was once not about advantage, but survival. It was a desperate means of living and the only tool to carve a future out of the ruins of Korean War. The pen once lifted in the ashes of war has been passed down through generations. And it is still our greatest strength, reminding us that education was never just about grades, but about the courage to rewrite and reform our own future.